The morning air carried the faint chill of early spring, though the sun was already pushing to the haze and setting the cracked sidewalks aglow. 10-year-old Malik Johnson tugged the straps of his faded backpack higher on his shoulders as he walked down the block toward school. His sneakers, once white, now carried the dull gray of miles walked and playground scuffs, but he carried himself with a quiet determination. He hummed softly under his breath, a rhythm he'd picked up from his grandmother's kitchen radio, the kind of tune that steadied him when the world felt heavy. Inside their small, two-bedroom house at the edge of town, life always started early. Malik's grandmother, Miss Evelyn, had already been awake for hours, frying eggs and humming gospel verses under her breath. The smell of butter and coffee lingered in the air long after Malik stepped outside. She was a woman of steady hands and a watchful spirit, her hair pulled back tight and silver threads catching the light like a halo. She never let Malik leave the house without two things: a breakfast to hold him over and a blessing whispered as her hands rested on his shoulders. Walk tall, baby. Remember whose you are. Malik's father, David Johnson, spent most weeks working in Washington, D.C., as a clerk for one of the Supreme Court justices. It was a kind of job that carried weight and whispered power, though in the Johnson household, that wasn't how it was spoken of. To Malik, his father wasn't the man in the suit walking the marble halls of the nation's highest court. He was a man who called every evening to ask about Malik's homework, who recited bedtime stories over the phone, and who promised that every sacrifice he made was for Malik's tomorrow. David could have moved the family closer to D.C., but he chose to keep them here, in the small southern town where his roots were deep, where Malik could be raised among the people and lessons that shaped him. On weekends, when David returned, the house filled with laughter. He would sit cross-legged on the living room floor with Malik, sketching constellations onto scrap paper and quizzing him on their names. Orion, that's the hunter, Malik would say with pride. They'd play chess on a set missing a pawn, with bottle caps standing in. Malik always lost, but he learned patience, how every move mattered. David called it strategy for life. Malik, just like how his father leaned back in his chair after every game, grinning like the boy had given him a real fight. Mrs. Carter stood at the front, arms folded across her chest, her blouse neatly pressed, lips pursed as though she had been born disapproving. Her reputation followed her like a shadow. Students whispered of her sharp words, her swift punishments. Some children, mostly the ones whose parents donated to PDA fundraisers, never seemed to draw her ire. Others, kids like Malik, carried targets on their backs, though they never knew when the arrow would fly. Malik slipped into his seat, the second row from the back. The desks were arranged in straight lines, like soldiers awaiting inspection. He placed his pencil carefully on the chipped wood surface and folded his hands, waiting for instructions. Around him, the wealthier students pulled out their bright new binders and stacks of paper, their supplies gleaming as though they themselves were a statement of status. One girl in the front row unzipped her backpack and laid out a rainbow of gel pens, as though setting a banquet table. Mrs. Carter scanned the room with hawk-like eyes. She noticed everything: the sagging straps of Malik's faded backpack, the way he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She had long since decided he was one of those kids, the kind who needed lessons in responsibility, in discipline. She mistook the weariness in his eyes for carelessness. "All right, class," she said, her voice sharp as chalk against the board. "Pop quiz. Take out your notebooks." The sound of zippers and rustling filled the air. Pages flipped open. Pens clicked. Malik sat still, his heart thumping harder than before. He slipped a hand inside his backpack and pulled out nothing but air. His throat tightened. He lifted his pencil, stared at the empty desk before him, and tried to steady his breathing. Mrs. Carter's eyes landed on him. "Malik," she said, voice tinged with suspicion, "where is your notebook?" He swallowed. "Ma'am, I don't have one today. Can I borrow some paper?" His voice was quiet, respectful, careful. He knew the way to how words could be used against him. The room went silent. A few students stifled giggles. Mrs. Carter's lips curved into something almost triumphant. "You don't have one again?" she said, projecting her voice so the entire class could hear. "How many times are we supposed to give you chances? School is not a charity, young man." You come here to learn, and learning requires preparation. Malik's ears burned hot, but he kept his gaze fixed on the desk. His grandmother's words pulsed in his head. Walk tall. Don't let them see you break. Mrs. Carter paced closer, heels clicking against the floor. If you can't take responsibility for your own education, then you don't deserve to waste our time. Pack your things. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Some kids gawked openly, eyes wide. Others looked away, discomfort written on their faces. Malik sat frozen, fingers trembling against his pencil. Please, ma'am, he said softly. I'll share with someone. No, Mrs. Carter snapped. I will not tolerate laziness in my classroom. Out! Malik rose slowly, lifting his empty backpack onto his shoulders. The room blurred slightly. Tears threatened to spill, but he forced them back. He would not give her that satisfaction. As he walked toward the door, he felt the weight of every stare on his back, each whisper cutting like glass. That morning, Malik's backpack carried only half of what he needed. A single stub of a pencil rattled in the front pocket. No notebooks, no folders. Miss Evelyn had promised she'd buy him more when the money came in, but for now, he'd have to make do. Malik didn't complain. He never did. He had learned from both his father and grandmother that dignity wasn't about having everything. It was about carrying yourself with pride, even when you had little. As he reached the school gates, children poured in from every direction. Some arrived from freshly washed SUVs, their backpacks bulging with crisp supplies and iPads tucked neatly inside. Others, like Malik, walked in on worn sneakers and carried what little they could manage. He noticed the differences, but he didn't dwell on them. He kept his head high, nodding to classmates, answering greetings with a shy smile. That morning, before stepping to the classroom door, Malik paused for just a second, staring at the chipped paint of the frame. Somewhere deep in him, he carried his father's voice, steady, firm. Your worth is not measured by what you carry in that bag, son. It's measured by what you carry inside you. Malik nodded to himself, then pushed through the door, ready for another day. He had no way of knowing that by the end of it, his quiet dignity would be dragged into the open, tested, and humiliated, and that the world would soon learn who his father truly was. The school hallways buzzed with the restless noise of children, sneakers squeaking against linoleum, lockers clanging shut like metal drum beats. Malik walked slowly, holding his pencil in his palm like it was more precious than gold. He kept his head down, weaving through the tide of students until he reached his fifth-grade classroom. The walls were lined with motivational posters. Success starts with preparation, and winners never quit. Phrases that hung heavy like commandments. The hallway outside was quiet, almost too quiet. He stood there for a moment, alone, the echo of the classroom door shutting behind him, sealing his humiliation. Somewhere deep inside, a small ember of anger flared. Not the kind that lashed out, but the kind that waited, steady and patient, for justice. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something larger than him, larger than his father, larger even than this town. This was the moment when one teacher's cruelty would unlock a truth too heavy for the walls of that classroom to contain. The principal's office smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish, the kind of scent that clung to schools no matter how many years passed. Malik sat in a hard wooden chair across from Principal Daniel's desk, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. He stared down at his sneakers, tracing the dirt along the edges, as though memorizing the scuffs might keep his eyes from welling with tears. Behind the desk, Daniels adjusted his tie and glanced at the slip of paper Mrs. Carter had sent with him. His voice carried the tired indifference of a man who believed his decisions mattered only insofar as they kept the peace with the wealthiest parents in town. So, Malik, he began, leaning back in his chair, it seems this isn't the first time you've shown up unprepared. Malik opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels raised a hand before the boy could form words. Now, I understand times are hard for some families, but rules are rules. We can't keep letting you come here without basic supplies. It disrupts the learning environment. The word rules clanged inside Malik's head. Rules always seem to bend for certain kids, the ones whose parents donated new computers to the library or sponsored the football team jerseys. But for kids like him, the rules were iron bars, unyielding and sharp. Daniels scribbled his signature onto a suspension slip, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. 3 days out of school, he said flatly. Maybe you'll use that time to reflect and come back prepared. He slid the paper across the desk. The boy's name, written in dark ink, felt like a verdict. Malik reached out with trembling fingers and took the paper, folding it carefully as though neatness might somehow make the punishment less cruel. He rose from the chair without a word, nodding politely before turning to leave. Daniels didn't look up as the door clicked shut behind him. The walk home stretched longer than usual, each block heavy with the weight of shame. Children's laughter spilled from playgrounds, a sound Malik usually loved. But today it felt like a reminder of what he'd been denied. His chest ached, but he carried himself the way his father had taught him, with quiet dignity. Shoulders back, head lifted just enough to tell the world he hadn't been broken. When he reached the small house, Miss Evelyn was on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the slip in his hand before he spoke, her eyes narrowing with concern. "What happened, baby?" Malik tried to explain, his voice cracking as he told her how Mrs. Carter had sent him out, how the principal hadn't listened, how the whole class had stared. For a moment, the strong woman who had weathered decades of struggle looked as though the world had knocked the breath from her chest. She reached for him, pulling him close, rocking him gently against her shoulder like she had when he was smaller. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered into his hair. "You hear me? Nothing." That evening, the house was quieter than usual. Dinner sat cooling on the table, untouched. Malik kept replaying the scene in his head. The sting of Mrs. Carter's words, the silence of the other kids, the scratch of the principal's pen. He felt small, like the world had closed its doors on him. Yet somewhere in that silence, a flicker of resolve took root. By the time headlights swept across the front window hours later, signaling his father's arrival from D.C., Malik had rehearsed the story over and over. But when David Johnson stepped through the door, still in his suit, his face drawn with exhaustion from the long drive, Malik found he couldn't say it. He simply handed his father the folded slip. David read it slowly, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his face still but fierce. He looked at his son, then at his mother, and then back at the slip. His silence was heavier than anger. Finally, he knelt in front of Malik, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he said, echoing his mother's words, but with a weight that felt like a promise. He tucked the slip into his jacket pocket, straightened his tie, and kissed his mother's cheek. His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it was a current of steel. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll set this right." And in that moment, Malik felt the first stirrings of hope, that the humiliation he carried might not be the end of the story, but the spark of something larger than himself. The next morning, the school buzzed with its usual chaos, children streaming from buses, parents herding little ones across the parking lot. Teachers clutched coffee cups like lifelines. But as Malik and his father walked side by side to the front doors, there was something about their presence that shifted the air. David Johnson moved with deliberate calm, his suit pressed sharp, his polished shoes tapping against the linoleum floor with measured certainty. He held Malik's small hand, not tightly, but firmly enough to remind his son that he wasn't walking into this building alone. They approached the main office, where the secretary looked up from her desk, startled by the sight of a tall black man in a dark suit escorting a boy who should have been suspended. She fumbled with a sign-in sheet. "Sir, can I help you?" "Yes," David said, his tone courteous but clipped. "We're here to see Principal Daniels. Right now." The secretary hesitated, her eyes darting between Malik and his father. There was something in David's steady gaze, however, controlled, unyielding, that made her reach for the phone without another word. Moments later, they were ushered into the principal's office. Daniels rose from behind his desk, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I wasn't expecting you. Please sit." David didn't sit. Instead, he gestured for Malik to take the chair while he remained standing, tall and composed. "My son was suspended yesterday," he began. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that made Daniel shift uncomfortably in his chair. "I'd like to hear, in your words, why." Daniels cleared his throat, tugging at his tie. "Yes. Well, Mrs. Carter reported repeated unpreparedness. "We have standards here, and—" David cut him off with a single raised hand, not rudely, not angrily, but with the precision of a man who had spent years inside rooms where silence was just as powerful as speech. He let the pause hang in the air before speaking again. "My son was humiliated in front of his peers and removed from his classroom because he did not have a notebook. Is that correct?" The principal opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded reluctantly. "Interesting," David said, his voice still even, "because from what I understand, the role of an educator is not to punish a child for poverty, but to ensure every child has equal access to learning. Would you agree?" Daniels flushed, shifting in his seat. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you this isn't about—" David reached slowly into his jacket. For a brief moment, Malik thought of all the times he'd seen this gesture on television, in moments that ended badly for men who looked like his father. But instead of anything violent, David withdrew a slim leather wallet and placed it deliberately on the desk. He opened it to reveal a badge, embossed in gold, gleaming under the fluorescent light. Daniels leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the words, "Supreme Court of the United States." The room grew still. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. David spoke quietly now, but with undeniable force. "I clerk for one of the 9 justices of the highest court in this nation. I work in a building where every day men and women wrestle with the meaning of equality, justice, and the rights of citizens. And yet here in this office, my 10-year-old son has been denied the dignity of an education because he couldn't afford the same supplies as your wealthiest students." Daniel's mouth opened, searching for a defense, but nothing came. His face had gone pale, the sweat gathering at his temples. David leaned forward slightly, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Do you understand what you've done here? Do you understand that what happened in that classroom, is not just poor judgment, but discrimination?" For the first time, Malik saw the fear in the principal's eyes. It wasn't just fear of exposure. It was a realization that the power he wielded so carelessly could be stripped away in an instant. David closed the wallet, sliding it back into his jacket. His composure never broke. His voice never rose. "We will not be silenced. We will not be dismissed. And you will not treat my son or any other child like he is less deserving because of the contents of his backpack." Malik sat in stunned silence, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt yesterday. Pride. Pride in his father. Pride in himself. Pride in the quiet strength that carried them both. And in that moment, the balance of power inside that cramped office shifted entirely. The principal no longer held the authority. David Johnson did, not because of the badge, but because of the truth it represented. By the end of that week, whispers about what had happened in Mrs. Carter's classroom were spreading through the town like wildfire. Children had gone home and told their parents about how Malik was shamed in front of everyone, how he was sent away for having nothing but a pencil. At first, it was little more than murmurs at grocery store checkout lines or quiet conversations outside church doors. But then, a shaky cell phone video surfaced, filmed by a student who had captured Mrs. Carter's voice rising above the classroom noise, barking her condemnation, sending Malik out into the hallway like a criminal. The video found its way onto social media, bouncing from one timeline to another until it reached people far outside the borders of their town. In the clip, Malik's voice was barely audible as he asked politely for paper, his tone timid but respectful. Then came Mrs. Carter's cutting words, followed by the sound of laughter from a few classmates, and finally the slam of the classroom door. The image of Malik's small figure leaving, shoulders square but trembling, struck a nerve. The community divided almost instantly. Some parents, especially those who had long complained about discipline issues in the school, rushed to defend Mrs. Carter. At a local diner, a group of them spoke loudly about kids these days needing to learn responsibility. But others, particularly Black and Latino families, saw in Malik's humiliation a mirror of their own children's struggles. They began sharing stories of detentions for talking too loud, suspensions for disrespect that boiled down to little more than backtalk, punishments that seemed to fall disproportionately on their sons and daughters. When a local paper picked up the story, student expelled over lack of notebook raises questions about equity. It was framed as a question of class and race, of whether poor children were being penalized simply for being poor. Then came the reporter's discovery that Malik's father was no ordinary parent, but a clerk at the Supreme Court. The headline on the Sunday edition landed like a hammer. Supreme Court insider son suspended. Education bias in our own backyard? The media attention drew cameras to the schoolyard. News vans parked along the curb, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Journalists sought interviews with anyone who had seen the confrontation. A few students, emboldened by the video, admitted on record that Mrs. Carter often singled out Malik and others like him. Parents who had once stayed quiet out of fear of retaliation began to speak, voices trembling at first but gaining strength. At the Johnson house, the phone rang constantly. Some calls were from reporters seeking quotes. Others came from civil rights groups, education activists, and lawyers offering help. David answered each call with calm precision, careful never to let his words slip into anger. "This isn't just about my son," he told them. "This is about a pattern, about children being made to feel small before they even have a chance to grow." Not all the attention was welcome. Anonymous letters appeared in their mailbox, some laced with threats, others accusing the Johnsons of making a mountain out of a molehill. On social media, strangers questioned Malik's character, his upbringing, even the legitimacy of David's job. Malik, who had once loved reading the paper with his grandmother, now flinched when he saw his name in print. And yet, amidst the backlash, allies emerged. At church that Sunday, the pastor spoke from the pulpit about dignity, about the sin of humiliating a child for circumstances beyond their control. Congregants nodded, murmuring in agreement. After service, parents formed a circle around the Johnson family, laying hands on David's shoulders, on Malik's head, praying for strength. The story had grown larger than a single boy and a single notebook. It had become a question that reached every kitchen table in town. Whose children are we protecting, and whose are we punishing? David knew then that the fight could not remain in whispered phone calls or private meetings. It was moving into the public square, into the places where truth and accountability could no longer be ignored. The storm was building, and he and his son stood directly in its eye. The Johnson dining room had been transformed into something resembling a war room. The table that usually held Sunday dinners now lay covered in papers, suspension reports, and stacks of letters from parents who had quietly endured similar injustices. Malik sat nearby, drawing constellations on scrap paper, his small presence a reminder of why every document mattered. David leaned over the table, reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his posture steady. Beside him sat attorney Carla Reyes, a longtime friend and civil rights lawyer who had driven down from D.C. when she saw the story on the news. Her dark hair was tied back, her sharp eyes scanning each page with focus that could slice steel. On the other side of the table, Miss Evelyn folded her arms, her expression carved from years of knowing when to trust words and when to demand action. "These numbers are damning," Carla said, tapping one of the charts. Black students in this district are suspended at 3 times the rate of white students. And look at the reasons: disruptive, unprepared, defiance, all subjective, all excuses to remove kids who don't fit the mold. David nodded slowly. "It's a pattern, and patterns don't lie. We take this to the Department of Education, to the state board. We don't just overturn Malik's suspension. We force him to confront the entire system." From the couch, Malik's voice piped up softly. "Will Mrs. Carter get in trouble?" The adults paused. David turned toward his son, his expression softening. "This isn't just about her, Malik. It's about making sure no other kid is treated the way you were. We're not here to ruin lives. We're here to change them." The boy nodded, though his small shoulders sagged under the weight of understanding more than any child should. By the next week, David had arranged meetings with other parents. They gathered in the fellowship hall of the church, folding chairs creaking under the weight of their frustration and fear. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation from the school or the town. But when David spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who believed deeply in the words he was saying. "My son's suspension may have made headlines," he told them, "but your children's stories are no less important. Every humiliation, every unnecessary punishment, Every moment your child was made to feel less. It matters, and together we can make them listen. Parents began sharing testimonies. A mother described how her daughter was suspended for talking back when she had only asked to use a bathroom. A father recounted how his son was written up for insubordination because he didn't bring a binder his family couldn't afford. As the story spilled out, the room shifted. Fear gave way to solidarity. Meanwhile, Carla drafted a formal complaint, citing federal civil rights violations. David reached out to colleagues in D.C., planting seeds with journalists who specialize in education inequity. Every move was calculated, every word deliberate. There would be no rash anger, no wild accusations, only facts, evidence, and strategy. At night, when the house grew quiet, David sat at his desk with a Supreme Court badge resting beside him. It wasn't the badge itself that gave him strength. It was what it represented. Years of study, sacrifice, and the hard-earned belief that justice, though slow, could bend toward truth when pushed. He thought of his son asleep in the next room, of his mother humming gospel in the kitchen, of generations before him who had carried burdens far heavier than a suspension slip. This fight, he knew, was part of a longer march. The following week, a packet of documents landed on the desks of the school board, the superintendent, and the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. It contained not just Malik's story, but a mountain of evidence, statistics, testimonies, and that damning video clip. The school district, once smug in its authority, now found itself cornered. Cameras were rolling, lawyers were watching, and a community long silenced was finding its voice. David wasn't seeking vengeance. He was building a case so strong that even the most stubborn walls of denial would crumble under its weight. And with every step, he reminded Malik and himself that their strength lay not in anger but in truth. The school board meeting was supposed to be routine, budget allocations, curriculum votes, small-town bureaucracy grinding on in fluorescent-lit monotony. But by the time the gavel struck with that evening, the room was already overflowing. Parents filled every seat, lining the walls, while cameras from local and national outlets pointed toward the dais like rifles aimed at truth. David sat in front row, Malik beside him in his pressed shirt and tie, legs swinging nervously above the floor. Carla Reyes was there too, a slim leather folder in her lap, her eyes sharp and unblinking. Miss Evelyn sat behind them, her hands folded on her cane, the matriarchal anchor of 3 generations. At the long desk in front, the school board members fidgeted. The superintendent, red-faced and sweating under the lights, shuffled papers as though they might shield him from the storm. And at the far end sat Mrs. Carter, the teacher whose single, cruel decision had set all of this in motion. Her face was tight, pale with indignation, as though she herself were the victim. The chair cleared his throat. "We'll now open the floor for public comment." David rose. The room quieted, cameras tracking his every movement. He walked with measured steps, his posture composed, his voice steady when he began. "My name is David Johnson. My son, Malik, was suspended from this school for not having a pencil. A pencil." His words lingered, heavy in the air. "But let's be clear, this is not about one pencil, one boy, or one teacher. This is about a system that punishes black children for being poor, for being visible, for daring to exist in spaces not built for them." He lifted a stack of papers, setting them gently on the podium. "Here are the numbers. In this district, black students are suspended 3 times more often than white students, most often for disruption or unpreparedness. Vague words, convenient words, words that allow prejudice to wear the mask of discipline." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carla leaned forward, sliding open her folder. "We've also filed a federal civil rights complaint," she added, her voice clear and unwavering. "The Department of Education has been notified. We are prepared to take this case as far as it must go." The superintendent bristled, gripping his microphone. "Mr. Johnson, Ms. Reyes, this is not the proper forum for legal grandstanding. Discipline is a matter of order and respect. If your son—" The room erupted with gasps and shouts before he could finish. David raised his hand calmly, the gesture enough to restore quiet. He looked the man dead in the eye. "My son showed respect," David said softly, "even when his dignity was stripped in front of his classmates. even when a teacher chose humiliation over compassion. My son carried himself with grace, something this institution could learn from. Then, from his jacket pocket, David withdrew a small badge. The gold glinted under the fluorescent lights. The official badge of a clerk to a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He set it gently on the podium. The room inhaled as one. I work in the highest court of this nation, David continued. I see daily what happens when institutions fail their duty to protect the vulnerable, and I will not allow that failure to consume my son or anyone else's child in this community. For a long, unbroken moment, silence pressed against the walls. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The camera zoomed in. Even Mrs. Carter lowered her eyes, her indignation faltering under the weight of truth. Then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out. That happened to my daughter, too. Another voice followed. My son was suspended for nothing. One by one, parents rose, their voices breaking together into a collective roar. What had begun as Malik's story was no longer as alone. It was the town's reckoning. The chair tried to gavel order, but the sound was swallowed by the rising chant. Justice! 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 David did not shout with them. He simply rested a hand on Malik's shoulder, steady, unyielding, his gaze locked on the board. It wasn't rage that held him upright. It was resolve. The truth was out now, undeniable and uncontainable, and the people who had long been silenced were no longer willing to bow their heads. This was no longer just about a pencil. It was about power and who had the courage to confront it. The morning after the school board meeting, the town felt different. The air was sharper, alive with quiet electricity, as if something long buried had been unearthed. Local newspapers plastered the story across their front pages. Photos of David's badge gleaming under fluorescent lights. Malik's wide-eyed face beside him. The national outlets weren't far behind. CNN trucks rolled into the county square. Parents who had once whispered in church pews and grocery aisles were suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices no longer hushed. For the Johnsons, the days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and community rallies. Carla moved with the intensity of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a moment like this. Miss Evelyn, with her steadying hand and piercing gaze, became something of a figurehead herself. Elders from across the county came to sit at her table, recalling old fights fought and battles lost, reminding the younger generation that none of this was new. Malik returned to school under the weight of whispers, some supportive, others dripping with the same cruelty that had once shamed him. But when he walked into that classroom with his backpack freshly packed, pencils, notebooks, everything lined in perfect order, it wasn't fear that bent his shoulders. It was pride. He knew the world was watching. And more than that, he knew his father was watching, his grandmother, his community. He sat tall at his desk, his very presence a quiet act of defiance. The teacher, Mrs. Carter, avoided his gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she distributed worksheets. The district announced her resignation a week later. But David knew this wasn't about one woman losing her job. It was about the system bending, however slightly, toward accountability. Months passed. Policies were rewritten. A task force was formed to monitor racial disparities in discipline. Parent councils gained more power. None of it came quickly, and none of it came without resistance. But change, like water against stone, began to carve its path. One evening, as the sun sank low over the porch of Miss Evelyn's house, David sat with Malik curled up beside him, his head resting against his father's chest. The cicadas sang their endless song, and the world felt, for the first time in months, still. You know, Daddy, Malik said quietly, when she kicked me out, I thought maybe I wasn't good enough for school. David's chest tightened. He kissed the crown of his son's head, holding him close. You are more than good enough. You hear me? You belong in every room you walk into. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. Malik nodded, his small fingers tracing the edge of his father's badge where it lay on the table beside them. I think I want to be a lawyer one day, like Ms. Reyes. So kids like me don't get treated like that. David's eyes blurred with tears. He didn't try to hide. He looked over at Miss Evelyn, who sat rocking slowly in her chair, watching them both. She gave him a small, knowing smile. "This is what legacy looks like," she whispered. The camera of the world might move on, but in that moment, on that porch, something eternal had been planted. Not just a fight against injustice, but a seed of hope, of dignity carried forward. Malik's story would not be the last, but it would not be forgotten. As the night deepened and the stars came out one by one, David leaned back and breathed in the summer air. For the first time since that day in the classroom, his heart felt lighter. They had not won everything, but they had won enough to prove that silence was no longer an option. And in that quiet, starlit moment, a father held his son and whispered the truth that would carry them both forward. "We are unbreakable." Teacher expels poor kid for not having supplies. Then his father's Supreme Court badge changes everything. The morning sunlight filtered through thin curtains, painting the Johnsons' modest living room in soft gold. Malik sat cross-legged on the rug, carefully sharpening a pencil until it came to the finest point he could manage. His small backpack rested beside him, light in weight, but heavy with the quiet shame he carried. A few loose sheets of paper, a single half-used notebook, and one dull eraser. His father, David Johnson, watched from the kitchen doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand, his eyes soft with both pride and worry. David was a man of discipline and quiet resolve. His life had been shaped by duty, first to the law, then to the truth, now to his family. Few in the small Mississippi town knew of his full past, and David had learned to keep it that way. Around here, being a black man meant people only saw what they wanted to see. Another face, another statistic, another assumption. But Malik saw the father who tucked him in every night, who traced legal briefs by lamplight, while whispering to his son that knowledge was a shield. The Johnsons lived with David's mother, Miss Evelyn, whose presence filled the house like the steady hum of gospel music. She had survived Jim Crow, marched on dusty roads in Montgomery, and carried scars she rarely spoke of. Her love was fierce, quiet, and laced with unshakable faith. At breakfast, she reminded Malik, "Your mind is your sword, baby. They can't take that from you." He nodded, smiling, though his eyes flickered with doubt. That doubt hardened into something heavier later that morning. The school smelled faintly of bleach and pencil shavings, the fluorescent lights buzzing above Malik's head. His classroom was decorated with posters of presidents and scientists, all white faces staring down at the rows of mostly black and brown children. Mrs. Carter, his teacher, stood at the front with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a searchlight. She carried herself with an authority sharpened by years of quiet disdain, her voice clipped and cold when it landed on Malik. "Where are your supplies, Malik?" she asked, loud enough for the entire class to turn. Malik hesitated. I don't have them all today." His voice cracked, his small hands folding into his lap. Mrs. Carter's lips tightened. "Again? How many times do I have to say it? If you can't come prepared, you don't belong in my classroom." A ripple of laughter broke out from a few students, and Malik's face flushed hot. He stared at the floor as Mrs. Carter marched to his desk, her heels clicking sharply. She plucked his near-empty backpack and held it up for the class to see, shaking it like proof of some crime. "Go to the office," she said coldly. "You're wasting everyone's time." The silence that followed was thick with humiliation. Malik rose slowly, every step toward the door echoing louder in his chest. His vision blurred as he heard someone snicker behind him. In the hallway, his hands trembled. He wanted to disappear. But when the office called David at work, they summoned more than just a father. David arrived in silence, his tall frame filling the small administrative office. His suit jacket carried the faint smell of travel, the creases of a man who spent long nights chasing justice. Malik sat hunched in a chair, his eyes red-rimmed. Mrs. Carter stood beside the principal, her arms crossed with the smugness of someone certain she was right. "Your son refuses to follow basic rules," she began. "If he can't meet standards, he shouldn't be in this environment." David listened. His face revealed nothing, but his silence held a weight that unsettled the room. He walked over to Malik, crouched beside him, and gently took his hand. Then, standing tall, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small leather badge case. With deliberate calm, he placed it on the desk. The gold insignia caught the fluorescent light. The seal of the United States Supreme Court gleamed. The room went still. The principal shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Carter's confidence cracked, her lips parting but no words coming. "My name is David Johnson," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I serve as senior legal counsel to the Supreme Court, and I am here today not just as a lawyer, but as a father. My son will not be humiliated for circumstances outside his control. He will not be discarded because of your prejudice." The words landed heavy, undeniable. Power had shifted, not by force, but by truth revealed. What began as whispers spread to the town like wildfire. Parents posted on Facebook. A student, bold with their phone, had captured the moment Malik was sent out of class. By evening, the video reached local news stations. A black boy shamed for being poor, only for his father to reveal credentials that shattered the narrative. The clip was raw, undeniable, and it stirred something deep in the community. That weekend, David found himself at the center of a storm. Reporters stood on his lawn, microphones thrust forward. Activists from neighboring counties reached out. He hadn't asked for this fight, but now it was here. Miss Evelyn urged him on, her weathered hands gripping his as she said, "You've been given this platform for a reason. Don't waste it." So David strategized. He reached out to civil rights lawyers, drafted statements, and quietly coordinated with journalists who had been waiting for a story like this. He knew the district would try to bury the scandal, but he was prepared to drag it into the light. His weapon was not anger. It was law, history, and truth. The showdown came at a school board meeting. The auditorium packed with parents, students, and cameras. Mrs. Carter sat rigidly in the front row, flanked by district officials. David stepped up to the podium. His Supreme Court badge clipped neatly to his jacket pocket, a silent reminder of the authority he carried. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse with venom. He laid out facts, statistics showing disproportionate suspensions of black students, testimonies from parents whose children had been quietly pushed aside, legal precedents that made the district's actions indefensible. His words were precise, each one cutting through the room like a blade. When he finished, the silence was thunderous. Then, slowly, applause began. It grew into a swell, parents standing, students cheering, cameras flashing. The district could not contain it. The aftermath was not swift, but it was certain. Mrs. Carter resigned. Policies were rewritten. Oversight committees were formed. The fight was far from over, but the first cracks had been made in a wall that had stood for generations. Months later, on Miss Evelyn's porch, David held Malik close as cicadas hummed in the Mississippi night. His son's small fingers traced the edge of his badge. "Daddy," Malik whispered, "I think I want to be a lawyer one day. So kids like me don't get treated like that." David's throat tightened. He looked at his mother, who gave him a slow nod. Legacy lived not just in courtrooms, but in the dreams of a child who refused to be broken.